Hello, everybody. This is the Podcast Digest. My name's Dan Lizette. Welcome back. This is episode 129. Thank you all very much for joining me again in this great interview and conversation coming your way. Before we begin, though, I want to take just a quick moment first to thank all of you wonderful people supporting the show over on Patreon. Yes, indeed, there's a link in the show notes every single week that if you'd like to support this very independent one-man show, it would be greatly appreciated. Little as $1 a month goes a long way, especially if everyone listening did it. And also like to thank this week's show sponsor. My friends at Podbean are back. This show is brought to you by Podbean, podcast hosting and monetization. Easiest way to start podcasting. If you go to podbean.com/TPD, you'll learn more and you'll get your first month for free. I'll tell you a little bit more about Podbean as we go on. But let's get into this week's show. Episode 129 is sort of, in a way, a follow-up to 128. Last week, I broke my drought of recommendation episodes, came back with my very good friend, Michelle von Hershberg from Couple Things Podcast, and we talked about 4 great shows that you should be listening to. One of the 2 that I contributed to that conversation is an amazing show called The Hilarious World of Depression. It's from American Public Media, APM, and the host is John Moe. And this is, I guess you could say, an interview-based show, but so much more. And we get into that in my conversation that you're about to hear. It's a unique concept and one that I feel was sort of filling a void, at least in the way that John and APM went about doing it. And we get really deep into John's experience with putting the show together, from interviewing guests to all of the first season. This conversation sort of comes at the end of season 1 for The Hilarious World of Depression, and sort of John kind of looks back and reflects on his experience and sort of talks about how this amazing show came together. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, tell a friend, leave an iTunes review, anything you can do to support the spread of these wonderful conversations that I'm having. So without further ado, let's get to episode 129 with Mr. John Moe. All right, folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. As I mentioned up front, my guest this week, I'm very excited to be talking to Mr. John Moe from The Hilarious World of Depression. John, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining me. There's lots to talk about. In fact, this is the first time I think in a while that last week I recommended your show on one of my recommendations episode, and now the following week I have an opportunity to talk to you, which is excellent. But before we jump into the show and all that there is to talk about there, I'd like to always ask folks a little bit about themselves prior to the show. I've been doing some research. I know there's lots to talk about, but anyone who's not familiar with you, can you tell them a little bit about yourself?
I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm originally from Seattle, and I've been kicking around in various public radio iterations for the last 15 years or so, hosting all sorts of different shows, a lot of national shows through APM, and then I was a producer and host at KUOW, which is a station in Seattle. And I write a lot of humor. I've written some books that people can find if they look hard enough. And yeah, that's about it. I write things and perform things when given the opportunity to do so.
Which is perfect. Podcast fans, though, may have been introduced to you before, right? You had one that was, I guess, a radio show converted into a podcast later. That was Wits, correct?
Oh yeah, that was just sort of a stage show that snowballed. You know, like a lot of fun ideas. It's a crazy idea that gets out of hand. It started as an onstage interview series here in St. Paul, and then we started to add more and more comedy and get some bigger name guests, and it turned into a variety show, which was a radio show, which is a very difficult thing to maintain, and ultimately we were canceled. And but yeah, we existed as a podcast for a while as well. So you know, it's the changing face of the broad category that we call radio because we can't think of what else to call it.
What's interesting about this, and maybe this is not necessarily be a segue, but your first guest on The Hilarious World of Depression, Peter Sagal with Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, also sort of, it reminded me when I learned more about Wits in the recent days that it sort of reminds me of Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, sort of stage to radio to podcast.
Yeah, I mean, Peter's been a friend for a while, and he's always been a big supporter of my work, which is nice to have. So it was sort of a way of bringing his audience into podcasting and kind of giving a transition into this world with a radio voice in him that people were very familiar with, and a radio voice in mine that people may have heard once or twice.
They remembered somewhere in the back of their mind. They were trying to place it.
Right. Yeah.
So this show, I found it in the last couple of months, not long after it debuted. I'm a huge fan of APM, featuring Dinner Party Download and In the Dark, the hosts of those shows previously. And so I'm always got my finger on the pulse of what APM's doing. And when this came across, I went and checked it out. But let's take it from the beginning. This is obviously an interesting concept for a show and a title that just makes people say, what? Tell me about how this all began for you, the origin of the idea and what those early conversations were like.
Sure. I never know. People ask me that a lot, and I never know where to start. We had an event, a sort of an onstage launch party thing not too long ago, and I was able to trace the roots of the show back to World War II.
That's the beginning.
That's where it all starts. Yeah. My family's Norwegian. They're immigrants from Norway, and I think the Nazi occupation sort of had a profound mental health effect on a lot of people over there for many generations. But for me, it came about from dealing with depression myself since adolescence, and then working in comedy a lot and getting to know a lot of comedians through the work that I did, and noticing that a lot of them had dealt with depression as well. And I thought, well, I have this in common with all these people. I mean, it's almost easier to come up with a list of comedians who have not had depression. So I got to wondering kind of what the connection to those things was, and that led me to a lot more conversations. And what I found in talking to people was that comedians were able to explain the experience of depression really, really well, because that is what their skill set is. Good comedians, are able to take sort of an abstract concept and boil it down to an economy of words that cuts through all the fog and goes right to your heart, and often to articulate something that you hadn't ever heard in words before. I mean, that's the basis of the Jerry Seinfeld style of, do you ever notice that, da-da-da-da-da-da? And when that works well, it's like, yes, I've noticed that, but I've never said it out loud to anybody else. And I thought that skill could pair really well with this disease that is killing people and that people refuse to talk about in so many cases. So often we want to treat depression as if it doesn't exist, which only makes it fester and makes it worse. So I've been on a bit of a mission for several years to talk openly about depression and to encourage other people to do the same. I can't cure it. I don't ever give advice. I'm not a therapist. I'm kind of a dummy, but I think if we can at least get conversations started, that's going to go a long way.
I should say this now, John, because I want to make sure that I frame my next several questions in the right context. I am likely your exact target audience.
Oh, good.
And what I mean by that is that I was one who has any number of misconceptions, misunderstandings, and false premises about depression. Mm-hmm. However, in recent years, it's come to my attention that people close to me are suffering. And I said on my show last week with my co-host when we reviewed and recommended The Hilarious World of Depression that it was having a profound effect on me in terms of humanizing, in terms of stressing a reality that may not have been stressed to me personally prior. And so for that, I just want to set that as a background to the next question I've got for you.
Okay.
What I'm wondering is, so you have this idea, you've got comedian friends, your own personal experience, and this desire to break down a lot of the stigma I was just describing.
Yeah.
But was there any element of hesitation in bringing this to fruition where, are people going to talk to me? Are we going to be able to have this conversation? How would it resonate? Was there any hesitancy, or is that just my perspective?
No, there wasn't hesitancy. I mean, there's often when I set out on a project, I kind of just blindly believe it's going to work because I'm so sold on it. But it really was just a fantastic amount of buy-in that I got on this thing. I mean, I've been like on Twitter, I normally just make a lot of dumb jokes, but then on occasion I'll tweet about depression and about suicide and about mental health. And I had noticed that over the years, those, that small 1% of tweets that I do about mental health would just get this enormous reaction because there's plenty of people making jokes on Twitter and probably plenty that are funnier than mine. But I knew that when I talked about this, there seemed to be a hunger for people to talk about this. And so that made me confident going into it. The other thing that made me confident was just around the building and around town here in the Twin Cities, everyone I talked to about the project got excited about it. And whenever there was a permission to give, we got the permission right away. So within APM, people were on board. They were excited. They were, what can we do to make it happen? We went to have a meeting with Health Partners, which is our sponsor. And, they almost immediately said, what do you need? Here, let's cut you a check. Let's make this happen. And they had this Make It Okay project that they do that was a real natural fit. So I wasn't nervous in that I seemed to get thumbs up everywhere I went. It was a little tough to describe to potential guests what I wanted to do. I mean, a lot of them, like you said, are people I know already. So they kind of just trusted that I'm an okay guy and I make good work and I treat people fairly. So that helped. But we couldn't point to an episode and say, here's an example of what we're talking about. And they just had to kind of go on trust. So, that's why I relied on a lot of people I knew in this first season. Hopefully in seasons to come, we can point people to previous episodes and to the fact that we had a lot of success with this season. So I think that'll help.
Yeah, and that's interesting to me, too, about that approach, right? What was it? What was the context of the conversation that you started to have with some of these folks, whether it be, Peter or Andy or any of these guests that you had before in season one? What was that conversation like? What did you relay to them as the goals?
Well, I mean, in Peter Sagal's case, it was kind of unusual because he had caught wind of what I was doing. And he approached me at a party last summer and said, hey, I want in. And I said, well, and I had researched who had talked about this before. And I said, well, I didn't know that about you. I must have missed that. And he said, no, I've never talked with anybody about it before publicly. I've never spoken into a microphone about it, but I want to do it for the first time on your show. So, but in other cases, I just explained to people that we were doing this show where I wanted to talk to comedians about depression, talk to comedians who have dealt with it. I wanted to explore, I wanted to either learn about the connection between depression and stand-up comedy, or I wanted to be disabused of the notion that there was one. And ultimately, I just wanted to get more conversations happening and make people who might be listening to it feel a little less alone and a little more likely to go get some help. And, all these people I talked to, for the most part, except for Peter, have talked about this in public before, and they kind of know that it gets out there and it helps. I mean, Dick Cavett, who I was fortunate enough to interview, he's been having people come up and say that he saved their lives or he saved their father's lives since the 1980s, and he began talking about it. And so, the idea of let's get it out there and let's strip away some of the stigma and make it a little less taboo, that was something that people got on board for right away.
Do you think that there is you mentioned earlier that comedians are probably a good one to, tell the story, paint the picture and share their experiences, as, that's often what they do on stage. Mm-hmm. But have you, I'm assuming this is the case, but have you confirmed in your own mind, you mentioned sort of whether it's the case or not the case, have you confirmed at this point that there's definitely a through line from somebody who ends up in a life of comedy and have had these experiences?
My own opinion is that people with depression who are funny are more likely to go pro than people without depression. That's my opinion. I think that there is a sense of otherness to the world that someone with depression has, where you feel like you're not not speaking the same language, not quite breathing the same air as everybody else. And I think for somebody who's funny, and if they're funny, they're probably smart. Someone who's smart and funny can apply that situation to comedy and to kind of a different way of looking at the world, a way to reinterpret the world. So I think that draws funny depressed people into comedy. The other thing I think draws them in is that it is a very safe space. I mean, it's an incredibly competitive industry and it's full of jerks and drugs, but it's safe as well. And certainly this is something that is the case for me. I've done a little stand-up, not much. I've done a lot of acting. I've done a lot of theater. I've done a lot of music and performance. And for me, it's always represented a place where I know what's going to happen. I know that this is the set list that my band is going to play this night. This is the script I'm going to act. This is the order of events that's going to happen on the stage. This is the rundown for the radio show that I'm doing. Whatever it is, it's a bit of life that has a plan to it, and that gives you some relief from navigating the relative chaos of the world itself. And so, if you know that you're going to get up there on stage and you've got your tight half hour of material and you've performed it on stages all over the place, you know where the peaks are, you know what you need to do to set things up. It's a form of human contact because you're in the room with those people and you're playing them, you're feeling them, they're feeling their energy in the room. And so it is like a social encounter, but it's one that's very safe and it's not as riddled with anxiety as the regular thing is. I mean, when I hosted Wits, we did most of our shows here in St. Paul at the Fitzgerald Theater, and it's a 1,000-seat theater, and we sold out almost every show, and big crowds, and I on stage I had a resting heart rate. I felt great. I was just I could have dozed off. I was so relaxed. But then after the show, we all go out and mingle in the lobby and say hi to the audience. And to me, that was just the most terrifying thing I could possibly imagine. Like going in front of 1,000 people, recording something for a national radio audience, easy. Like talking to somebody over a drink, oh my God, that's awful.
So the sense of comfort or the therapy was to be found in the predictability, not necessarily the bright lights or the comedic reactions.
Well, it's the predictability, and I think it's the approval too. Right. You get an approval from an audience that is very clear, and people clap and people laugh, and people, are sitting in a seat because they intend to go watch you. Like it's all very gratifying. It's misleading, I think, and a little bit dangerous. This is something that I've, had to do a lot of thinking of and talking of with therapists myself, which is that for a performer, it's easy to think that applause and cheers and laughs are love, and they're not. They're just somebody being entertained for a little while. And so if you're looking to fill a hole in your life with something that an audience gives you, it's not going to fill the hole. And then you keep trying to stuff things in the hole, and the hole is never filled. I mean, I like the idea of the hole too. Like I was talking with a friend of mine who's a very successful comedian, and he said that his worst wave of depression was after he started playing like big rooms and theaters, and he was on TV all the time, and he had reached this pinnacle that as a kid he wouldn't dare dream of. And that's when it hit him the hardest, because he thought that the hole would finally be filled by these career successes. And it wasn't, because that's not the kind of hole it is.
And that realization set him back.
Yeah, because well, God, what did I do all this for?
Working.
Yeah, I mean, the money's nice sometimes if it works well, and and sometimes you get a good parking spot, but you're not gonna fill it up.
Yeah, I'm mesmerized by the concept, because I want to say that it wasn't completely foreign to me. One of the reasons, one of the biggest shows in the world, as we all know, is WTF with Mark Maron, and he talks a lot on occasion about his own battles, and obviously he's also had a significant career on the stage and TV and movies and with the podcast. And but I've always been fascinated by this counterbalance of a level of success while there's this level of pain and enduring, this disease at the same time. And I think that's one of the things that appeals to me so greatly about what you're doing with this show, is that you're peeling all that back and saying, this is sort of what these people are going through.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big part of the show, and it's a big part of what I try to explain to people, is that depression doesn't do an inventory of your life and then decide whether or not to strike. It just strikes, like you can't, I mean, it's you could be doing well, you could be doing poorly. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. I mean, it's like, we always have fun comparing it to other medical predicaments. Like, say, well, he's, his career is going so well. How could he have leukemia?
Right.
Well, because that's not how it works. Right. That's not how diseases operate. And it's kind of the same thing. Like, it just happens.
Hey folks, let me jump in right now and take a quick break from our conversation with Mr. John Moe and tell you about this week's show sponsor. Again, my friends at Podbean are back. What is Podbean? Podbean is podcast hosting and monetization. This is a name that you need to know if you are considering joining this wonderful club of podcasters, but with your own show. Or if you already have a show and you're looking for a new hosting provider. Podbean is something you need to think about. Why? Why do you need to make sure they're on your list of consideration? One, they're going to set you up with a great website to set up with your show. You're going to be able to customize that website with themes and colors. When you publish a new episode, you're going to be able to share that to all the social networks with some quality embeddable players right there inside the timelines. If you've already got your own website, Podbean's got you covered as well. They can integrate those posts into your existing website. All the support you're going to need, all the RSS stuff, the iTunes support, they can import or redirect your existing show, all the technical things that you're going to need to make sure are covered. Podbean has you covered. If you want to take it to the next level, they've got you set up with mobile applications, both for the Android and iOS ecosystems. Podbean has you covered there as well. When you join the Podbean family, you're going to be a part of their online directory and their promotional opportunities within that directory. If you go to podbean.com, you will see all kinds of shows on their front page, different categories, featured shows of the week. All of that comes along with joining up with Podbean. Also, statistics. I talk about them each and every week, how important they are and how addicted I am personally to statistics. It really gives you a read on your show, how it's performing, the audience you're reaching, and Podbean has you covered when it comes to comprehensive podcast statistics. And then even the next level after that is when you start to look at monetization, and Podbean has you covered there as well. You can designate episodes as premium. You can take, you can participate in their advertising advertising platform, or you can even launch and establish your own patron program where your listeners can support you directly. All of that and a bunch more comes with the Podbean experience. There's so many things and advantages that Podbean gives you over any other hosting provider, and I strongly encourage you to check them out. In fact, if you decide to do that and you go to podbean.com/TPD for the Podcast Digest, TPD, you're going to get your first month for free. So you basically get to try it without any commitment, without any worry, and figure out if this is going to work for you. And I have a feeling it might. It also tells them you came from the Podcast Digest, and I would very much appreciate that. So podbean.com/TPD to learn more and get your first month for free. My thanks, as always, to my friends over at Podbean for supporting the Podcast Digest. Now, let's get back to my conversation with John Moe. Let me shift gears just a moment. You brought it up, and I wanted to talk about it, your partnership with Health Partners and their Make It Okay campaign. You mentioned it briefly in terms of launching the show, but tell me a little bit more about that relationship with them and how the relationship ended up being something that became so prominent in the show as sort of the featured sponsor, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I think they're a Minnesota company, and they provide insurance and they provide medical care as well. So it's kind of a hybrid organization. And our company, APM/Minnesota Public Radio, had been looking for a way to, take their community outreach that they wanted to provide and apply it to something that we wanted to make. And sometimes you're trying to find a good fit. And they we just had a meeting, and I said, well, here's what I want to do. I want to demystify it. I want to make it less scary. I want to make a show that has comedians on it because I think they'd be good at it, but also I think it would help get the message out more. Like, you could do a really informative podcast with doctors down the road at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And I'm sure they're brilliant, brilliant people. They know more about the disease than I ever will. But I thought if you could get the human stories of someone like Maria Bamford, of somebody like Dick Cavett or Jen Kirkman, it's going to be more relatable and more people will download it. Like, nothing against doctors, but if I see Maria Bamford's name on a podcast, that is going on my phone in a hurry because I know it's going to be delightful because she's the funniest human. So yeah, that was kind of the thinking along those lines.
And one of the things I always talk about, and we'll get to the rest in just a minute, is sort of feedback from the listening audience. But is it safe to say, I think I caught at the end of the last one, this is the first 9, is that season 1?
That's season 1.
Gotcha. What's the feedback been from Health Partners? Have they been overjoyed, thrilled? Have they loved the experience?
They've been overjoyed and thrilled and loved the experience. It's gone really well because they had Make It Okay, and they were looking for a way to get more people to see it. And the big thing that they wanted, that they felt strongly about, was a section of the Make It Okay website with tips on how to start a conversation, what to say, what not to say. And traffic to the whole site is just exponentially higher, and to that portion of it in particular. So that was very gratifying for them. And, after we met with them, we kind of explained what we wanted to do. And then the support that they gave us, we wanted to try something where the goals were really aligned. So it wasn't just a sponsor writing a check. They had nothing to do with the content of the show. There was a firm brick wall there. Right. But it was an alignment of what I wanted to do with the show and what they wanted to do in their organization. And then that money that they were able to give us allowed my producer and I to travel around the country and get these interviews face to face. So we interviewed comedian Sam Gritner in Brooklyn, and I went to the apartment where he had attempted suicide a few months earlier. And it was the most meaningful and most difficult piece of radio I've ever made. And we went to Andy Richter's office at the Conan Show. We went to Maria Bamford's house. We went to all these places and really talked with these people up close. And I think that's and we've had good interviews over ISDN. We've had good interviews over distance. That's great too. But I think in a lot of cases, just sitting down with those people and being able to talk person to person, we were able to get some really meaningful stuff recorded that we all felt really good about.
Yeah, given the content, I imagine that in person probably makes somebody a little more comfortable to get into some of this stuff. But
yeah,
you mentioned Make It Okay, makeitokay.org. Folks, as always, links in the show notes. I'm putting that one in there as well in case you wanted to check it out. So that will be there too. Some more procedural, practical questions later in nature,
sure.
John.
Yes.
Show title, right? This is the first thing people hear about, and it is one I told somebody about it today, and they were like, it's called what? What was the conversation like in settling on that? It's such an attention grabber. Now that once you know about the show, it's perfect. But
yeah, I had originally pitched the whole thing as a book because I sent it to my literary agent, and we kind of kicked it around for a little while, and then I came to realize that the part I was most interested in was the sound of the interviews, the recording itself. And so that's when it started to become a podcast in my mind. And my boss at the time, who's Peter Clowney, he's over at Midroll now, he and I are very good friends, and he said, well, what are you going to call this thing? And I said, I will call it The Hilarious World of Depression, because I wanted to make a joke by thinking of the worst title I could possibly come up with.
right.
And he said, really? And I thought about it for a second. I'm like, yeah, I kind of think so. I wanted to, what appealed to me finally was that it seemed audacious and it seemed presumptive, and there was some dissonance built into it. And then that kind of went along with the tile, with the logo that they came up with, the designers here in our building. About the only note I gave them was make it look vaudevillian.
It's brilliant. I love the logo. It really is brilliant.
So we wanted it to be kind of obnoxious and a little unsettling. So, the kind of brassiness of the title and the bright orange color of the logo, we didn't want to make it look like an ad for antidepressants with a woman staring out the window on a rainy day.
But then you even went further. You really leaned into this, because I'm really curious about how the first 30 seconds of every episode came about.
Oh, when I ask
the question,
is depression funny?
Yeah.
That happened. That was kind of funny. Like, we came up with, my producer, Chrissy Pease, and I came up with sort of a set of questions that we knew we wanted to ask every guest. And that was one of them. Do you have any advice for people is another one. And then, a couple other standard ones that were in there. And that sort of came about a long time ago in some of the early interviews, but then when I started to cut tape, I really couldn't figure out where it fit in the flow of the conversation, because it probably started out to be more like a podcast about comedy, and it turned into more of a podcast about depression. So it's sort of a way of continuing the pairing of those two things to kind of signal that these two concepts, that we've already tipped you off with the title, these two concepts are going to be part of the show. But honestly, for the first one, I was just cutting tape on the first episode, the Peter Sagal episode, for a very long time. And I just thought, what if I put this right at the top as a cold open? And then I'll just do that for every show. So the decision-making process lasted about 3 seconds.
I love it. Now it's almost, it's great because it almost sets the tone, sort of, in some sense.
Yeah.
Right? It kind of gets, I'm thinking about a new listener who just scrolls through iTunes, sees it, listens, and it's like, we're going to address this right up front. The title of the show, we're going to get this covered right now. And it's a great approach.
Get a good tight answer, and then kick in the Rhett Miller music, and we're off and running.
And more on that stylistic topic, because what's interesting to me is, look, I'm not going to make any false impressions to anyone. What I do is I get to talk to super interesting people like yourself, John, and I pretty much go live to tape and put this up, and I hope people enjoy it. And the core of your show is an interview, but you guys have done so much more. You've inserted narration. You often have clips from your guests' work and so on and so forth. Talk about that conversation that you went through either with your producer, APM, or just yourself to make this much more than just a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about different elements to add in there. We kind of thought that given the topic, just one straight conversation about that could get a little heavier than we wanted, and it might be a little harder to turn, to make a transition from one point to the other. Without some other elements in it. So the idea of dropping in the stand-up clips seemed to make a lot of sense because in a way it's an extension of the things that these people are saying, and it's an extension. It's a reinterpretation of the same ideas, but as told through this other form, this stand-up that they're doing, and it was remarkably easy because a lot of times, we just had Paul F. Tompkins on the show, and he talked about how his mother at the end of her life, and Paul's obviously a very successful comedian, much beloved. His mother was dying, and she asked him, "So, what are you going to do for a career for real?"
Yes.
And he's more successful than almost every other comedian in the world. And it's so funny and sad. Yeah. And then we found tape where he had also talked about it, and he kind of expanded on a little bit and kind of riffed the jokes a little bit more on it because that's the setting. So we found that those went really well together. In terms of the narration, there are a lot of shows that do interviews that pretty much take the interview and put that up, and that's the show. Yeah. And so we didn't really want to – we wanted to find our own voice, and it was felt that the writing that I had done already on the topic and the conversations that I've had with people about the disease – led people to want to hear from me as well. Right. And given that I had a pretty good understanding of both comedy and depression, and often had a very good understanding of these guests, many of whom were friends, it just made sense that I could kind of walk through it. And so yeah, that's the approach that we took on that. It's I was comparing it the other day to it's still a show about the guest. When Andy's on the show, it's a show about Andy Richter, but it's like Andy is a basketball game and I'm your friend who knows a lot about basketball. And so, or depression's the basketball game, one of the two. Maybe depression is one team and Andy's the other. And I'm your friend who knows a lot about what's going on, so I can kind of talk you through it and hopefully enhance your appreciation for what's being laid down. Yeah,
you're the play-by-play guy. They're the color commentator.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Well, it works out well. And
I'm the Al Michaels of depression.
There you go. That's it. Hey, claim it. Lay claim to
right?
That one, John. You got it.
TM.
You mentioned earlier, at this point, 9 episodes in, we are now in season break before season 2. There will be a season 2, yes?
There will be a season 2.
Perfect. Now, as a podcaster, and I always like to say a big chunk of my audience are fellow podcasters, I was really curious when you guys did this. Episode 6. You combined 8 guests into a singular episode.
The super show.
I'm just dying to know the thought process behind that, because I'm going to say just for a second, could these not have, or several of them, been their own episodes?
Well, sure. I'm sure they could have. What we were looking at, when we started going out to record, we didn't really know what the show was going to be yet. And that was very much by design. I really wanted to collaborate with the producer that I had, and she wasn't able to start until shortly before we started going out and taping these things. And we had conversations about how the format of the show might be, but we didn't really know. And so we just thought, well, if we don't know, let's get as much tape as we can. Let's talk to as many people as we possibly can, and then just, have a lot of stuff to choose from. I kind of thought for a while it was going to be a show where maybe on this episode we're going to talk about depression and anxiety. And so here's what Dick Cavett had to say, and here's what Michael Ian Black had to say, and all these people. And sort of almost do a series of reports with all these potential sources. But what happened is I'm trying to remember what episode it was. When I was really listening to it, it was probably the Segal episode, I guess it would have to be, where I listened to it and I thought, I don't really want any other comedians on this, because I want this to be Peter's story. And I think that the story is the human experience, and the story is not each individual thing that comes up. With Maria Bamford, Bipolar 2 isn't the story, it's an element of a story about Maria. So we were supposed to do, I think, 7 to 8 episodes. We ended up doing 9. And so we had a choice to make of do we put a bunch in each episode? Do we just cut people and say, thanks for talking to us? I mean, which happens in the world of interviews all the time, and people understand that. But when we had kind of marked out who we had, we looked at the ones that were very complete, that were lifelong journeys, or brief, harrowing journeys in the case of Sam, where he really went to some extremes. Some of the other people we had, their cases of depression were milder, or they were having some trouble and they were able to address it fairly quickly and get back on course. And so in some cases they weren't really complete episodes unto themselves. In some cases we probably could have made it like that. But listening back to all these people, I thought, I could go one of two ways. I could just dump them all and just do that, or I could find a way to I could cobble together something where they would all fit together, but that could be an artificial construct, and I would just be trying to please people, which is probably related to my own depression. And then I was down some sort of psychological rabbit hole. But the more I thought about it, I'm like, well, what do they have in common? Well, what they have in common is what all these interviews have in common, which is, everybody's story is the same, but different, but everybody's story is kind of the same too. So that we decided to use those voices to point at the universalities of depression, of the average being adolescent, junior high school onset, a worsening, a bottoming out, an experiment in treatments, like all these things that kept coming up and up and up over and over again. A confrontation of how you feel about meds, a confrontation of how you feel about suicide. And so at that point, when I thought about that, I'm like, well, that's better to have a lot of voices in that case than to just say, okay, Michael Ian Black is representative of all these things. That wouldn't be fair to him, and it wouldn't fully illustrate the point.
Yeah, and it came out great. It had to be an editing nightmare, I can imagine, to put that together.
It was awful. That one was awful.
I guess the decisions about what to include. I'm surprised it wasn't a 90-minute episode, but it was only half.
I have the blessing and the curse of being able to write really fast. I don't know what it's for. I guess from doing journalism and from other things, but I can write very, very quickly. And so for that one, I probably wrote 5 or 6 complete scripts of how that whole thing would go together, like using completely different angles that I was coming from. And then I would write one and be like, nah, I don't know. And, start another one. And I think the one I ended up using was number 2 out of that whole stack, and just going back and reinventing it. But it's a curse because I know that I can always just start over. So I keep starting over and over again.
Right.
which negates the speed.
It definitely had to be a bear. I mean, a daunting task. I mean, and it came out excellent. I mean, I'm sure if you were to listen back to it now, there's probably about a dozen things you'd want to change, sequence-wise or story elements or what have you. But I love the end product for what it's worth. So
thank you. No, it was hard. The Sam Gritner episode was harder, but the Super Show was hard too.
Well, what made, besides the content, like you said, that was maybe the darkest episode. What made that one more difficult?
I just wanted to get it right. I wanted to be, I wanted to find a zone between artificially optimistic and morbid, which is a harder zone to find than I expected. It was hard on me too because Sam attempts suicide, as he describes in the episode. He attempts suicide. He takes more than enough pills to easily get the job done, and then wakes up 6 hours later. And he talked a lot about his brothers. He talked a lot about his family. And so for me, I lost my brother to suicide in 2007. And so it was sort of this idea of like, okay, if my brother had survived his attempt, what would he be saying? And so I was kind of haunted. I was dealing with ghosts as I was taping it and editing. And I had to learn from those ghosts. I had to kind of learn what my experience and my knowledge and my wisdom that I had gained from that was. But I also had to make it Sam's story, and I had to make it really honest and true to his experiences. And he, helped so much in that regard because he talks about his experiences in a very honest way. Like he's neither proud nor ashamed of his years of drug abuse and his suicide attempt and his failures. I mean, he's dead honest about all of it.
Right. For you personally, through season 1, you mentioned a little bit of it there in putting that episode together, but has anything changed or affected you greatly with this experience? Season 1?
I mean, I've been overwhelmed by the response. We really thought that we were making a nice little podcast that would find a niche audience and, might help somebody a little bit. But I get messages every day. I got several messages today. They come in through Twitter and Facebook and email and phone calls and letters. And they're almost all very positive about people just thanking me for making it. And they're thanking me on behalf of all the people I work with who made it. And some of the things they say are really stunning. The decisions that they've made, really healthy decisions to finally get to a therapist, to finally get on track with their meds, to not die in some cases, I hear from people. And it feels great to have helped them along a path to feeling better. It weighs a ton. Yeah. It's a lot to carry around, when you get those messages. But it's good. I mean, the thing that changed for me over the course of the editing was, after the first couple days of editing tape, I was just like, I got to go for a walk. I don't know how many hours a day I could do this without being crushed by everybody else's depression. Yeah. Until I realized that all the interviews that we do are comeback stories. They're all people who were in a worse place, who have found a better place and are working at it. And so, to me, it's not inspirational in the after-school special Lifetime movie kind of way, but it's really inspirational. Like that they're out there, that they're talking about it, and that they're just trying to make things better. And so that's, I really wondered, and I was asked by people close to me, is your depression so much in control that you can spend every workday thinking about depression?
Right.
And it turns out I could. So that was nice.
Well, and then in the end, right, the impact, right? Especially once you started to hear it, right, that you're quote unquote doing good, right? Would you consider this the most important project that you've undertaken yet?
I think so. I mean, professionally, certainly.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I it's funny. I used to be an actor, and I was dabbling in writing, and I thought, oh, I'm getting pretty good at writing. And I had this moment where I thought, there are a lot of actors out here, and a lot of them are better than me. And if I want to be as good as some of them, I'm going to have to work really hard at acting, and I don't wanna. And so I turned to writing, and I still act. I still do performance stuff here and there, but it kind of happened that way with comedy a little bit, where I've worked with enough incredibly funny people that when I work with them, I tend to put myself in a writer/straight man kind of role and let them be funny because they're funnier than me. And, you know, Wits was great, and it was great fun, and I love the music and I love the comedy. But I kind of had that same moment of, there are a lot of people out there doing comedy, and a lot of it is really good. I mean, you listen to Spontanea Nation, the show that Paul has, it's incredible. Yes. Yeah. And I'll never do that. But then I figured out, well, you know, what do people need? Well, not enough people are talking about depression, and, you know, how about something with that? It's like I had, like with depression and comedy, it's like I had this shed full of 2x4s, and eventually I said, you know, maybe I could just build a house.
Right.
I got all this equipment. Let's get out and nail some of these things together.
I don't think there's any doubt, John, that there was a vacuum here. There was a hole to be filled. You saw it, and you've built that amazing house at this point. And I think that's why you're getting the feedback.
Well, and I should say there are other shows out there in podcast world that deal with mental health and do it quite ably. You know, our decision that we made was one of specificity. We said, let's, you know, instead of taking on all of mental illness, let's zero in on this particular thing, and let's come about it in this particular way. So we chose to be very, very targeted. And
I've mentioned this in other shows too, other interviews I've done. I talked with Alana Levine recently, and she's had guests of the ilk like Molly Ringwald and Matthew Broderick. She's interviewed those folks. She's a stage and TV actor herself. And and there's something about a celebrity or a name that people just know. When somebody who could be suffering from this disease, John, sees somebody that they're familiar with and then hears their story, there's a relatability, and that impact of that message, I think, is amplified because they're already a fan, if you will, of that guest.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Andy Richter, and I mean, it's funny because he doesn't say a lot at one time on the Conan show, but he is one of the smartest, most articulate people I know. You know, and he's visible, and you know who he is, so you know he's successful. And he spoke very honestly about it. I mean, his episode is one that people keep bringing up to me when he says that depression's like a bad back. Yeah. You know, you just have to manage it. You just have to do some exercises. Sometimes you got to take some pills, and you know, you're going to be fine, but you just need to be aware of it.
Yeah, great episode. They all have been so far, John.
Thank you.
I want to talk about my final question for you is sort of, if you can, and I know you just wrapped season 1. Anything you can tell folks about season 2, maybe even just a window of time for a target when you might be coming back?
Well, I'm going to take next week off. And
we'll give you a week, John. We'll give you a week.
I'm going to relax a little bit at the behest of my boss. Yes. And then we're going to begin in earnest. So I would say, you know, in the next few months, we should be really gearing up. But we're going to put some stuff out there between now and then. We just decided this yesterday. So I don't, you know, I've hinted at it a little bit on Twitter, but we're going to put out a call for people's own funny experiences with depression, like when depression gets so ridiculous that you just have to laugh at your own situation. Right. So we're going to, in between season 1 and season 2, we're going to do some sort of quasi episodes where I talk to some listeners about their own experiences. So, I mean, we're building up this tremendous community, and you know, we want to stay in touch in between these big seasons.
It's a tremendous show, folks. It's a great listen, and I'm telling you, if you have any opinion on any side of the scale of depression, you need to take a listen to The Hilarious World of Depression, because you very likely will have some opinions changing, and I think it's important stuff. So, John, if they want to find you or the show, where can they go do that?
I'm on Twitter at John Moe, and the show is on Twitter at THW of D. Because we have a very long name. I was going to do at THWOD, but there's already a guy named Thwad in the world.
Can you believe it?
Thwad grabbed that one, and I couldn't have it. So THW of D.
There you go. Links in the show notes, folks, as always. John Moe, thank you very much for taking the time to join me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And that's it, folks. That is episode 129 of the Podcast Digest. What'd you guys think? Have you checked out The Hilarious World of Depression? Listening to that interview, have you hit subscribe yet in your listening app of choice to The Hilarious World of Depression? Because I don't know what you're waiting for. Conversation, production values, and insight into something that I have a feeling you may not know enough about, or you know a lot about. And if you do, then hearing the perspectives of John and his guests, I think is something of high value, and I think you'll find the same. So if you did enjoy this week's show, please take a moment, folks, leave a review on iTunes or your listening app of choice. If you listen through Stitcher, Google Play, wherever reviews are accepted, I very much appreciate you taking a moment and letting folks know what you think about the show. It's the best way to kind of bring in new listeners. Reviews do matter, help surface the show in charts and so on and so forth. So, and I also like to take a moment and thank this week's show sponsor one more time, podbean.com/TPD. If you're thinking about starting a podcast or looking for a great home for your existing show, you're going to get your first month for free if you sign up with that special URL, so you can try all of Podbean's awesome hosting features. Once again, one more time, my thanks to Podbean for supporting the Podcast Digest. And folks, that will do it for episode 129. We move to 130. It's coming at you really soon, next Sunday. Until then, for the Podcast Digest, my name is Dan Lizette.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.